How did you get into electronics originally?
Oh, God, that's a long time ago. I don't really know. I was, as far as I can remember, I was interested. But one of the first things that really got me interested was my brothers. One of my brothers was taking an old stereo sort of radiogram thing apart, and he took the valve amp out of it and stuck it in a wooden box for me to play with as a kid. So I basically had an amplifier, and it was wonderful because it was a black box about the size of a shoebox made of wood with holes drilled in, and if you peered through the holes, you could see this wonderful glow from the valves. It just looked magical. Valve electronics always does. And it could oscillate if you basically put your finger on the input, which is just a wire, and on the speaker output wire. You can get this thing to make all sorts of interesting squeals and noises. And it sort of, I guess, carried on from that.
When did you decide to do it for a living?
Well, I'd always sort of entertained dreams of being a scientist, I suppose, when I was a kid.
Right.
That's what I was going to do. So I went off to university to do electronics, and I guess bumped into a guy called Neil Mottershead, who had his own computer. I also had my own homebrew computers by then, and we were just friends. And the gaming industry was just coming into existence because things like the ZX81, which we all laughed at, it was hopeless. And the Spectrum appeared, and I remember we were looking at some game or other on the Spectrum, and we just sort of looked at each other and thought, well, we could do a lot better than this. So, ended up, actually, that's slightly jumping the gun, because the first thing we did that was commercial was Neil had written an assembler for the NASCOM 2, the home computer he'd bought. I mean, I built my own, and Neil had basically had enough money to buy them. And he'd written an assembler for it, and a couple of guys at the Hall's residence who were already running their own software company, Chris Clark and Graham Stafford. And I think Chris had set it up with someone else who was calling it Crystal Computing, and it was they've been basically selling tapes from small adverts they were able to place, and they had a couple of really awful games for the ZX81, and we bumped into them, and essentially somehow the idea came together about selling Neil's assembler. And it ran on the NASCOM, and I basically sort of I'd written my own operating systems, things for my own computers, and I basically said to them, well, I'll do a front end sort of editor and monitor for it. Stick your assembler on the back, and you've then got a little editor assembler thing we could actually sell, and that came to pass. In fact, I came looking through my old stuff the other day. I actually came across the contract for that from Crystal. Anyway, that's basically what started it. And
that was Zeus, wasn't it?
Yeah, Zeus, which Sinclair actually got interested in because it was far and away the fastest assembler for the Spectrum. In fact, it was really annoying because one of the magazines did a sort of review of all the available assemblers for the ZX Spectrum, and they basically on all the others, when you told them to assemble, they'd trundle away and take sort of tens of seconds or minutes or whatever to assemble their test source. And when they hit A for assemble on Zeus, the cursor just came straight back. And the thing about Zeus was I'd given it a screen editor where you could move the cursor around on the screen, and if you put the cursor on a line that had a command on it and hit return, it would basically enter that command again. And as a result of it doing that, you didn't really want to clutter the screen up by saying, okay, I finished assembling, it was this many bytes, it took this long, and so on. So fundamentally, when the assembler finished, it just came back and gave you the cursor, which, for their test source, which was only a dozen lines of code or something, this took a millisecond. So as far as they were concerned, nothing happened. And they basically, the guy who was doing the review sort of went, well, it's a nice assembler, but in his head he thought, well, I'm not actually quite sure it did anything, so I'm not going to say anything about how long it took, because I'm not sure how long it would take, because I'm not sure I actually got it to do anything. So they basically said Highsoft's assembler was the fastest, it was something like 70 times slower than Zeus. Right. It took long enough for him to notice it had actually done something. So anyway, that was annoying.
And as you said, Sinclair took it on as well, didn't they? They published it.
Yeah. Well, they weren't entirely stupid, and I think one of their engineers had a NASCOM, so I think he might even have met Neil's original assembler anyway. So they realised it was the fastest, and assembler took it on. Sinclair took it on, which was interesting because they repackaged it, and we got quite a lot of kudos for basically having a Sinclair branded product. And I think they sold something maybe 5,000 in the end, which is quite a lot of sales for an assembler.
Yeah. How did Halls of the Things come about? Because obviously it's one of my favourite games.
Yeah, one of mine. That came about because of the NASCOM. There was a game on the NASCOM called The Keys of Kral, which I don't honestly know who wrote it. It did have a name in the source, but I think that was some guy who'd converted it from something else. And it was basically your typical Dungeons and Dragons, where you drew a map. And you had monsters and potions and magic spells and things. But it was written in BASIC. So if you can imagine this, superficially the thing looked a little like Halls, and you had a maze on the screen, and the character sort of moved around like, that sort of rate. And it had, one of the weapons it had was firewall. We actually lifted a lot of the ideas from it, Halls. It had fireballs, and at one point Neil was playing this on his NASCOM, and I think Martin and I were sort of just sitting in the same room watching him do this, and some monster fired a fireball at him, and this thing's written in BASIC. It takes about half a second per move, so this fireball follows Neil. He wasn't the fastest keyboard user on earth, so he's like running along at some horribly slow rate with this blob following him, and he ran round a wall, and this blob followed him around, and I looking at this and basically thinking, this would actually be quite good if it went faster. Sort of the three of us were just. I think Neil actually managed to get caught up on some treasure or something and got hit by this. It was really quite funny that something so hopeless had caught him. And anyway, we were looking at it and thinking, there is a game in there. If you did this properly, you'd actually have a decent game. So, and the other games we'd seen, I'd written games for years by that point on my homebrews, things like Space Invaders and so on. And we just thought, fuck it. People are writing shit. The games on the Spectrum are complete crap. We could do something better. And that's basically where Halls came from. Right.
I like the way that the things were quite nasty, weren't they? They some of them disguised themselves as treasure and stuff like that.
Yep. Yeah, it was a great experience writing Halls, because essentially we wrote it on one of my homebrew computers. It wasn't written on the Spectrum. And the three of us would fight over the keyboard. It was basically, you'd sit there with one person typing, and the other two would be looking over their shoulder, sort of going, "No, you've missed it. Oh, yeah, you've missed a comma, missed a comma. Oh, yeah, blah blah blah." And then whoever had the best idea for doing the next thing we were trying to do, would basically grab the keyboard and get on with it. So it was a real collaboration. At the time. Well, actually, as we were coming towards the end of it, we basically sort of said, well, if anyone asks who wrote Halls, we'll never tell them who wrote which bit of it, because it really was a collaboration where you couldn't have told who'd actually come up with any particular idea. And it's sort of, because I've carried on modifying it over the years, it's been attached to me as a game. Simon Brattel did all this. It's really absolutely not the case. It was a brilliant collaboration between the three of us. Right. And I could point out bits that I know one of us particularly did. I did the bars on the energy bit. I can tell you that for a fact, because I did it on holiday once when there was a university holiday, because we're still at uni when we did this. And I went home for the holidays and ended up adding that bit. So, I can claim that. And I think Martin had a lot to do with the sword, and Neil did the mazes. But in general terms of who wrote the game, who did any particular bit of gameplay, it just was a collaboration. Right. And I think all the better for it as well.
Yeah. When did you start to know that you had something special?
As it was getting near completion, we basically set it up on a television in one of the common rooms at the Halls of Residence. It's part of Owens Park in Manchester. And initially there was grumbling from the people there because the television, they wanted to watch some TV program or other. But we said, no, you like this. We stuffed halls on. And over the course of maybe about 4 hours, this thing ended up being a party with about 30 or 40 people in this room fighting to get at the controls. I mean, it was actually, for most of the time, there was somebody sitting on a couch in front of the television with the Spectrum on the lap, and then there'd be people sat around them on the floor, like reaching over. So one person had his finger on the F key, and I think there's some woman with a finger on the L key, and basically, you get, whenever a monster appeared, you'd get cries from the audience going, F it, F it. And at one point, the three of us sort of retreated to the back of this room and just sort of said, we've actually got a real hit here. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. So that was the point which we thought, yes, this really is groundbreaking. This is something that's never been seen before.
Well, I sought it out because I saw mentions of it on letters pages. I think it was in ZX Computing or something like that,
Yeah.
And so I sought it out, and my first thought was, oh my God, because you get the menu, and there's about 16 different keys, isn't there?
Oh, no, 19.
Was it 19? Right.
19 keys.
And I mean, I think it works better with all those keys. I mean, you had to spend a bit of time, remembering where they were, and especially when you're dashing about and you're trying to avoid a fireball and stuff like that. Did you ever consider, though, just simplifying it to make it more of a sort of arcadey type game?
Not at the time. But in recent years, when people have started running Spectrum emulators on little handheld things and phones and so on, I simplified it a lot for those. So, in fact, I added a new version called Blitz Halls, where essentially all you have to do is wander about. You don't have to do anything. It'll open doors if you run into them. It fires automatically if there are things. It's very much a sort of an arcadey version of it. You can't actually get killed unless you are, I think something disables your shields. Can't remember offhand, but essentially it's like an introduction, quick game. But you can play that on a handheld device because all you got to do is steer. And I also changed it so when you bump into things, it's less likely to stick on them. So the player slides round corners,
I see.
Which always was a pain. And when you bump into dead things, it pushes them out the way now.
Okay.
And in fact, I have to say I prefer this version of it with the mods, with the simpler keys.
Right.
Yeah.
You later adapted it to be Wizard of Firetop Mountain.
Oh, yes.
So how did that deal come about? It was Penguin Books, wasn't it, I think?
Yeah, one of us, I think it was Graham, I think, but I could be completely wrong. I think had bumped into Ian Livingstone, I think it was, at one of the Games Workshop shops, and they got talking, and they said, "Well, yes, we'd like to get into computer games, and we'd like somebody to do an adaptation of Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which is their best-selling book/game at the moment, or book/set of action figures, or whatever they were doing. There was something they were selling at Games Workshop, and they arranged a meeting with their publishers of the book, which was Penguin. And at that point, nobody had ever done a deal for getting no book publisher had ever been involved in a deal with a games publisher, computer games. So we were the first, and nobody really had any idea what we were doing. And as a result of that, we got a huge royalty rate out of them. I think we got 20% or something. It's, as opposed to 5 or whatever that a book author would typically get. So it was it was the first time it had ever been done, a games tie-in, and B, we got massively more out of the book publishers than they'd ever give anyone else. But one of the things, I mean, they liked Halls, is why what brought them to the table, is they'd actually played it and thought it was great. So they basically said to us, we want something like Halls, but we don't. There are no magical weapons in the Warlock Firetop Mountain, so you'll have to get rid of the magic. And we were dubious, and they also wanted a much bigger maze. Of course, this causes a problem because you've got to store it, and the maze in Halls takes up 16K of memory, which is basically a third of the memory on the machine is tied up just being the maze, storing where everything is.
Yeah.
So for Warlock, we had to compress that down. The maze on Warlock, I think, is 256 times bigger. They wanted a really big maze to get lost in. So we had to drop from storing sort of, but in halls, if you actually look at a room, it's 7 by 7 characters, and each of those is a byte in memory. So you basically have different things in each of the spaces, and they can store information on how much value your treasure has, or how much magic a bottle's got in it, and so on. Whereas on Warlock, we couldn't do that. We had to have a list of where things were. We just had, I think it was a bit for each wall. So what would have been a cell on halls, 7 by 7 and part of the maze, became a single byte on Warlock, just with flags to say whether the walls existed. So the maze became a lot bigger, but also a hell of a lot sparser. We just literally couldn't store enough information about things to have more than a few things in the maze.
Right.
There were more monsters, but again, without magical weapons, all they had was swords. I think they had swords and arrows.
Yeah.
So we added the ability for the things to use the sword. And that was basically it for the weapons. And it's really very boring. I mean, there's some aspects of Warlock I like, which is the tension, because when you actually meet the Warlock, there's one Warlock in the whole maze. The little bugger is nasty. It moves fast and it chases you around. So, the anticipation builds up as you wander through the maze trying to find it. But that really is about it for the game. I think that without the magic, I think it lost a lot of interest.
Yeah, I thought so as well. But I still liked it. It had its charms, didn't it?
It did, but some people absolutely hate it, and I sympathise. There were aspects I liked, but they were few and far between.
Yeah.
And more the jokes, actually. I mean, you get a sign of how bored we were with the game, that we actually sort of added jokes, like when you pause it, you get different messages coming up. And that's always a sign that the programmer's sort of bored with the game, and they're adding things like that.
Yeah, I remember the B-side of one of your games. I forget which one now, but it had the CFAX.
Yeah, Darkstar.
Darkstar, that was it. Yeah.
Darkstar was fun. It started out as a Starfield demo I'd done for Basil with my computer, and we quite liked it. And sort of started working out sort of you could draw lines as long as you were very, very careful, and horizontal lines draw a lot faster than the other sort. So you try and have a lot of those. And do 3D games, but they're so mindlessly boring because you spend months just squeezing the T states out of your routines to try and get everything to go fast enough.
Yeah.
And really, Darkstar was a very impressive 3D graphics demo because it moved at nearly frame rate.
Yeah.
When everybody else was doing things like 2 or 3 frames a second. Absolutely hopeless. But in terms of game, you really can't do very much game when you're trying to minimize all of the processing.
Yeah.
So I was getting very, very bored spending months just squeezing a few T-states out of line drawing. And if you remember back to when the Spectrum first appeared, Sinclair, one of his adverts, in fact, several of his adverts basically had the thing showing CFAX pages, which of course it couldn't do. It didn't have the resolution, but you could sort of fake something up. And it was part of his marketing that he could do proper teletext and so on. I think possibly because the BBC Micro could do it, and it really could do it. And he had to be seen to be in competition with it. So it had always been a sort of standing joke that the Spectrum was supposed to do CFAX and couldn't. So at the back of my mind, I was sort of thinking, well, it'd be quite nice to do some joke teletext pages. So I knocked up an editor for my own computer that let me edit pages. Basically told everyone in the building they were welcome to come along and sort of add pages to this, and at some point I might put an emulator on the back of one of the games and do it as a joke. And I think Neil did one page and everybody else shied away. Simon Jackson and I, who were good friends, we wrote quite a few pages of jokes for it. But it wouldn't actually have happened except because I was running out of time and I didn't actually have the time to write the CFAX emulator itself. except that Martin Horsley, who wasn't doing anything else, took a weekend out and actually wrote the code to take the data I'd stored and turn it into pages. And actually had nothing to do with that, and it was brilliant. He said it was absolutely, he got the idea straight away of doing joke teletext and made a really, really good job of the teletext emulator.
Yeah, it works really well.
It's great, isn't it? So fundamentally, I thought, well, yeah, okay, we're going to do this. We'll stick it on the back of Darkstar. And because there were some sort of quite scurrilous allegations and comments about reviewers and things in there, nobody was happy about it going out as plain text, so we basically added a password to it. And I put clues to what the password was in the high score tables on Darkstar, thinking that people would figure it out fairly quickly, but nobody ever did. We actually had to publish it a few months later. Yeah, when the hue and cry would have died down, and the people couldn't interfere, the reviewers couldn't have panned it and covered our sales.
Didn't you also wind up the magazine reviewers? You something to do with a supercomputer that you had at Crystal that was doing all the work for you, or something like that?
Yeah, we used to joke that Basil actually wrote the code, and I just sat there drinking coffee. Sadly, not true.
You were one of the first people to sort of dabble in proper 3D, weren't you, on a Spectrum, though? I think like Rommels Revenge, things like that.
Rommels Revenge. My development system, the machine I'd built, the homebrew computer I'd had, there was a whole age before things like the ZX81 and the PET and the BBC and all these home micros came out, where people were actually building their own computers at home. And it's been completely forgotten, which is a shame. But some of those machines, I mean, most of them were very limited, but some of them were actually really quite capable computers. They're all very idiosyncratic, and we had to write our own operating systems and things, so the software was just really different. It was an age of great creativity. But anyway, part of my machine was that I had an interesting graphics driver on it that could draw lines pretty quickly. So at some point, probably 1983 or so, I'd also taken a Pascal compiler that was originally for the NASCOM, a thing called iSoft Pascal. Brilliant. I mean, it was actually a full Pascal compiler for a Z80. It's a great achievement. And I'd converted that to run on my homebrew computer. So you could basically write programs in Pascal that talked to the display hardware, and they could draw lines fairly quickly. And I think Martin did nearly all of the work. We were sitting there one day discussing Battlezone, the game we all loved, a lovely game. And he basically said, well, I don't think it's that difficult to do. Go on then. So he'd sat there one afternoon basically writing the code to do a Battlezone. And got as far as drawing all of the pyramids, triangles, pyramids, squares on a landscape and moving around. And he did that in an afternoon in Pascal. And because the line drawing hardware was quite good, it actually ran quite fast. It would have been playable if you'd sold it as a game. Just to prove the point that he understood how to do the 3D graphics. And it's very impressive. And he then basically went off and did Rommels Revenge. And the only part I had in that was I named it. He couldn't think of a decent name for it. But it was entirely Martin's work done with Zeus 1, the assembler on the Spectrum itself. Obviously, microdrives is an absolutely astonishing feat because every time it crashed, you lost your code and you had to start again. So, brilliant. In fact, Martin went off and did that while Neil and I were doing Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is basically just a Defender clone, again, just all about being fast. And where was I going with this? Right, yes. So Martin had basically figured out how to do 3D graphics, and I was playing around with the idea of what could you do. And everyone starts out with a star field where you just have stars moving around. And as long as you don't do rotates, you can live pretty quickly on the Z80. The problem is if you rotate, you have to do multiplies for the maths to work. Whereas if you're just sliding through a cube full of stars, you can do that with just addition, which makes everything a hell of a lot faster. It's as soon as you try and rotate, things get slow. So I was basically playing around with what impressive looking visuals you could do by just sliding through this cube full of stars. And at one point it occurred to me to put them all in a plane, and so that you basically just flying up and down over a flat surface of stars, and that looks quite impressive. And again, it's fast because you don't need to do any multiplies for that. So instantly you get the idea of, well, let's call that planet surface. So now we've got flying through space and we've got flying over the surface of a planet. What else can you do? I wrote some line drawing code. Basically, it was pretty quick at drawing horizontal, vertical lines, and quite a lot slower at drawing lines at any angle. So you basically scratch your head and work out what shapes you can draw, basically with straight lines that aren't sloped. And you can just about do towers. You can tolerate a couple of any lines at the top for the pointy bits. You figure out you can just about get away with doing spaceships as a set of parallel lines. And basically with all of these hacks, and you spend weeks hacking all of this, you get to the point where you've got something that moves very, very fast with very, very simple graphics. And that's basically what Darkstar was. And the amusing thing was that I'd started out by doing it with Pascal and any lines and full rotates, and ended up with something that looked very much like everyone else was doing, where you can rotate and you've got lines at every angle, and the graphics sort of in a static picture look much better. But as soon as it starts moving like chunk, 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 it's horrible. So it amuses me that sort of the reviewers particularly would sort of look at Darkstar and go, yeah, it's fast, it's great. And then they'd look at whatever it was, Star Strike or something, when the competitors did, which was essentially where Darkstar started before we started getting clever. And they go, oh, yeah, but this is technically more advanced because it does at every angle. No, sorry. You're technically a lot less advanced because that's where we all started and realised it was completely hopeless. And then moved on and improved it.
Did you say the name from the film, Darkstar?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
How can you not steal a name from a film that's got somebody chasing a beach ball with a broom? some very good humour in Darkstar.
Oh, I love it. It's one of my favourite films as well. So at some point, it changed from Crystal to design. So what prompted that?
We were essentially sued by a company called Crystal something else. We were Crystal Computing. It's called Chris after Chris Clark, the guy who set it up. It's eponymous. Crystal Computing, good name for him. The rest of us weren't wedded to it, of course, because it wasn't our name. And we then got some previous company that had been doing computer peripherals for microcomputers for some time before we started doing games, was called Crystal something else. And they basically got in touch and said, oi, we're using the name Crystal, bugger off. So we decided it wasn't worth fighting, we'd actually change it. But we had no real ideas for what to call it. Now, Design was a name I'd been using since I was about 12 years old. Probably, I can't remember that far back, but it was probably inspired by Barbarella's Duran Duran. Or maybe just the group Duran Duran, who knows. But I always liked the name Design because it's basically what I wanted to do. I wanted to design things. And in the absence of any better names, I basically suggested we just call the whole thing Design. And I was smart enough to say, but if I ever leave, I want to take the name with me. Which ultimately happened a few years later. So anyway, that's how we ended up being Design. Right,
okay. Why do you think you never moved on to 16-bit as a company? Was it just too much investment needed? Or
no, well, what happened was I was getting on for 1984, 1985 or so, after Darkstar. Sort of Neil and I had been muttering for some time about wanting to do development tools rather than games. And the rest of the company wasn't particularly keen. I won't say that they were against it, they just weren't particularly interested in doing it. And it's a real shame because the development tool market for the PC, for instance, we actually wanted to move on to the IBM PC, which wasn't a games machine because the display was hopeless, but would have been an ideal machine to do assemblers and compilers and things on. And if we'd actually made that move, then I think we would have occupied the position that Borland occupied and become stinking rich. So it's really bloody annoying that we couldn't actually persuade people to go down that road. But as part of that, I wanted to get my hands on a PC, and a friend of mine, a guy called Abdul, who was doing music software and bits and pieces, he came along and said, well, I've got a PC. I'll give you a PC if you just help me with some software for an MSX. He was doing a MIDI sequencer of all things for an MSX computers, and basically said if I helped him with that, he'd give me a PC, which would basically said, yeah, okay, that's a no-brainer. So I went and did that, and essentially, because of poor communication, some of the other guys at Design Crystal Computing, whatever we were calling it then, they basically sort of went, well, you're working with somebody else, and we're not happy about this, and it sort of blew up into an argument. So I just went, okay, forget it, I've had enough, and walked out. So that was basically my noble leaving of the games industry. I'd had enough of it by then. I mean, if you actually look at Forbidden Planet, the last game I wrote officially, and you look at the high score tables, you could tell I'd had enough. I mean, the lyrics are really very depressing. I think what was the last line? Get to Christmas and feel no regret.
So what did you do straight after design? Well, straight after leaving Crystal Design?
I set up as a sole contractor, basically designing software, mostly some hardware to order for people who needed it. Didn't do very well. It's quite strange because the first year I was out of the games industry, I think I made about £2,500 in total. Really, I wouldn't have been able to make it except for the fact that the guys I was living with, because we're still living like the life of students, essentially student residents. There were three of us sharing a flat, Jim and Steve, and they basically gave me food and paid the rent and so on, kept me afloat. And then the year after that, I doubled it, and the year after that, I doubled it, and the year after that, I doubled it. And basically, just from word of mouth, from successful designs, I just got more and more and more work. Until I actually ended up making a hell of a lot of money. But I had the luck to bump into a guy through a friend who wanted some video display stuff designed, and sort of ended up in business with him doing displays. But yeah, it were a couple of hard years, and then it got a lot easier.
But you've been doing that ever since?
Pretty much. I actually worked with the same guy, me and Rainer, worked with him for, must be getting on for 30 years.
Wow. So what's the most interesting projects you think you've worked on doing that sort of thing?
The ones I can actually talk about. Mostly scientific instruments. I mean, we did all sorts of shit. I mean, we did bits and pieces for air traffic control systems. We did bits and pieces for the military. We've done bits and pieces for aerospace, medical equipment, or lighting. Did a hell of a lot of lighting applications. Scientific instruments. They're probably the most worthy things we've done. Ended up designing virtually all the electronics from mass spectrometers. A couple of those. In fact, I'm back into that now. So it's actually been fun.
Have you got any ambition to sort of go back into games?
No, not really. I don't think I could. I think it's moved on. I think in some ways the industry's they're not making a mistake, because it's the biggest industry in the world, essentially, so you can't really accuse it of making a mistake. But I think it got too obsessed with everyone becoming filmmakers. And the basic idea of simple little games, like, I'll cite Tetris as an example. Tetris is an idea one person could have come up with and did, which absolutely pisses all over games written by enormous teams with massive amounts of money invested in them. And the interesting question is, how many other game ideas like Tetris are there out there, which are incredibly simple and no one's had them yet? I suspect there are many. And I just think it's a shame the games industry has become so tied in with enormously expensive, overblown, complicated films.
Yeah.
That reflect reality. It just seems counterintuitive to me that if you're doing computer graphics and you can do anything you like, that people just spend their time trying to recreate reality.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We should be more adventurous than that.
Yeah.
I mean, my favourite games over the years, paradoxically, I got really quite sick from 3D games when they became first-person shooters. They actually get motion sickness from them. I mean, if my son plays Minecraft when he played it when he was a kid, he still does play it, but when you're playing it with a kid, he just flip the view around all the time, zooming around, rotating. I mean, I literally couldn't watch it for more than about a minute before I started feeling sick. So that kind of steered me away from doing 3D games, which is a shame. I might have done something like a proper modern version of Darkstar other than that.
Right.
But my games over the years that I've really liked from other people are some car racing games, some very simple ones. Tokka 2 was great. The Gran Turismo games were great. Project Cars is great. So having just insulted people for simulating reality, I like some of them. I enjoy the latest two of the Zeldas, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I think Tears of the Kingdom is a fantastic game with the creativity they've introduced into that, where you can build things. That very much has the air of what we would have done, I think, if we were doing games, because you can basically do jokes. There's quite a lot of humour in it. In fact, it always amused me the first time I came across a treasure, buried treasure, that when you try and open it, it leaps out the ground at you and there's a monster attached to it. It's crossed my mind to wonder if that is a reference to Halls.
Well, thanks for doing this, Simon. And I know you're quite a busy man, so it's nice for you to take a few minutes to just do this for us.
No, that's great. I mean, I should have prepared something instead of doing all the umming and ahhing, but yeah. Anyway, no problem.
Thanks again, mate.
I like your books. You've done really well.
Oh, thank you very much.
No, brilliant. And that gives an old fossil a little bit of a chance to reminisce.
Well, good evening anyway, Simon. You take care, mate. Thank you.
Yep, same to you, Sean. And I'll try and get up there at some point. It's been far too long.
Yeah, for definite, mate. You take care then.
Okay. All right. Cheers.
See you later. Bye-bye.